Hi everyone, welcome to a new series. This is Tiny Experiments. So, regular viewers of the channel have probably seen the couple of, I suppose, tongue-in-cheek promos that I did for this series. It's not something I usually do, but it just happened to coincide with me dabbling with some AI video generation stuff. And as a sort of, having a bit of fun. I don't, as long-term viewers of the channel know, I don't tend to take myself too seriously. I thought I'd have some fun putting these together, and it was great. And sometime in the future, I'm going to do a Tiny Experiments episode on using, the free open source video, AI video production resources that are out there. I don't know quite what to call it, but anyway, that area. But that's a little bit further down the line because I need to play around with that a little bit more, and I think I've already blown the allocation on my free tier in Google Gemini. So yeah, I'll have to wait for that to reload. So I did a couple of these trailer type things, like heads up videos coming soon. So there's this one, and then more recently, a couple of days ago, this one. And so let me just talk a little bit about what this Tiny Experiment series is going to be all about. So recently there's been two main non-Magic the Gathering series which I've done quite a few videos of that were relatively new. One was the gentle introduction. Another one was experiments in AI. And both of those are going to carry on as series, but slightly intermittent, when the mood takes me. Gentle introduction is now going to have mainly non-AI stuff, so probably mainly programming, where I'm not talking about necessarily it's not specifically about say Ollama, but it could be where I'm looking at how you might use a programming language to access APIs. So I'm sort of moving that into that series exclusively. Experiments in AI is going to keep or stay around, and the idea there is to have slightly chunkier code, if you like, bigger sections of code that deal with certain things in AI that I want to experiment with, but as a sort of big, I wouldn't say a big application, but as a larger application. And so while I was wrestling with how to sort of divide all this up that made sense in my brain, I came up with the idea of these tiny experiments. Now, what this actually was inspired from, and some people might already be aware of a book called Tiny Experiments, and I'll sort of get onto that in a moment. But the idea with this series is to keep the code I'm going to do, not surprisingly, really tiny, and it will be both AI related and just program related, so it'll flip-flop between the two. And as the series moves through, you'll get a feel for what sort of things I'm going to include. But that's the sort of origin story. Now, how this was, the spark here was that I actually went away for 10 days. You wouldn't know it by the videos I release because I sort of pre-stack a load of stuff before I go away. So most people aren't aware that I'm away for 10, 12 days somewhere, because I pre-shoot quite far ahead, 3 weeks ahead. And then what I'll normally do if I know I'm going away somewhere for a break, I'll shoot some extra videos so I don't have to worry about anything till I get back. That's how I sort of do it. It's just the smoke and mirrors. So yeah, we recently took a trip to the UK to visit my folks over there. And what we usually do at the tail end of the trip, we go up to London for a few days. And while we were sort of mooching around London, and we usually stay, well, it's pretty much become a thing now. A tradition is to stay in Paddington Basin and use that as our base of operation. It's easy to get into here from Heathrow because you just use the Heathrow Express, and then easy to get out when we have to fly back. But also relatively easy from here to get, various underground services all over the shop and all sorts of other things as well. So yeah, it's a great base of operation, and I really like staying around here. It's in this nice area, Paddington Basin, and there's this really nice canal walk you can do, so you can sort of walk out from Paddington Basin out to this area here, Little Venice, and then you can carry on along the canal path. There is a bit where it goes through this tunnel, so you just have to go along the road a little bit there, and then back onto the original canal towpath, and you can walk all the way through to, well, here, the top of this area here, which is the Regent's Park. There's London Zoo there, so the canal sort of skates around the outside here. And if you carry on into Camden, you get to Camden Lock. But on a previous trip, we'd actually walked from, we've been up to Camden Lock, and we actually walked from there through to Islington, where we were going to something in the evening. So you can actually carry on down. It's not so clear, but it's here, and you end up in the Angel Islington. So you can carry on down, and I believe it carries on even further. There's a really nice canal walk you can do all the way down and end up here, I think, if you want to do it. But so far we've done the sort of those two sections on two separate trips. So this time we went from Paddington Basin to Camden, and on a previous trip we went from Camden to the Angel Islington. And the other nice thing about this is that you can walk up to Primrose Hill, and there's a really good view here. So that's what we actually did. We sort of came up the canal and then took a detour down here. And the reason why I'm rambling on about this, it is connected. I just fancied a bit of a rambly video. In the course of wandering around London, visiting various places, like bookshops, I stumbled across this book, which is sort of this book called Tiny Experiments, How to Live Freely in a Goal-Obsessed World. And it got me thinking about like times in my life when I've had, my career or what I've done has been at its most interesting. And I thought, it was probably when the jobs I were doing involved a lot of experimentation. Either as a result of, say, if I was working, responding to customer complaints, or on some sort of helpline where I needed to follow up with some sort of proof of concept experiment, those sort of things. So I did find that, I tend to much prefer a sort of tiny experiment approach to life than necessarily a goal-obsessed approach. And what I find interesting with experiments is you sort of do one experiment and then that leads into another, and that builds onto another, and so on and so on and so on. So from that, that's where the idea for this series comes, and we'll have a look in a moment what that's going to look like. And in today's episode, I'm going to look at this whole thing of stuff you can do with prompts in terms of tweaking them in certain ways. Let me just see if I can bring up my thumbnail recently, which is at the end of in fact it's at the end of this video. There we go. So yeah, this whole idea of augmenting a prompt in some way beyond. So in addition to the meat and potatoes of the prompt, adding in other things that also affect the execution of the prompt. So things like temperature, issuing additional sort of precursors, that sort of thing, and some negation type augmentation as well. So we're going to be looking at that. So yeah, I as you know, I like to reflect on where ideas come from. So that's why I've done this preamble. But while I'm on the subject of visiting Camden, one of my favourite places to go there, and I wanted to name check it, is Raven Records. So I took the chance to visit in there, and myself and my wife, we sat at the bar in there having a drink. They have an alcohol-free bar. My wife had a very nice cocktail. I had a nice ale there as well. Well worth checking out. Particularly if you like more extreme music. It's definitely a record store for people that are into heavy metal. But they're really nice there, and it's lovely just to sort of hang out, sit at the bar, chat about music, which is one of my favourite things to talk about. So it's my wife as well. They have a pretty cool room downstairs as well. There's a picture somewhere of me standing in front of this, and there's another picture of my wife, I think, sitting on this throne. So a very cool place. So if you ever find yourself in Camden, check it out. Yeah, it's over there. It is. So pretty near to Camden Town Station, and that in turn is pretty close to the Underworld, I think. I've been. There's the Electric Ballroom. I used to go. When I used to go to gigs in London, this is where I used to come quite a bit, actually. Anyway, back onto the actual series. There's quite a long preamble there. So there's a number of different things I want to tackle in this series. Information theory is one of them. A lot of the technologies that underpin AI, machine learning, those sort of things. How you can access things like APIs from different languages using very simple stepping stones. So as I've said, the AI experiment series is going to carry on. I got loads of stuff in the pipeline I was playing around with before I went away and after I came back, which I've yet to think about. So there's loads of stuff there. I've got some stuff I'm planning to do in tiny experiments to do with Claude Shannon and some of the stuff around entropy. If that's sort of stuff you're interested in, there's a couple of sets of experiments for that I've sort of pushed off to the side for the moment. And we're going to start off with this one. Was originally going to do a sort of pilot type episode, but I found it was going to repeat a lot of stuff I was going to do in other series, so I knocked that on there. That's why that's called episode 00. So that will never be. So let us dive in after that rather long and winding preamble. So yeah, we're going to look at some prompting ideas, and this in some ways also acts as a nice bridging video because it consolidates some of the stuff that I was talking about in my run of the original series AI experiments, or experiments in AI, or whatever I called it. So let us have a look and run this, and I'll talk through what we've got here. And the idea with this is, and I'm going to upload this to my GitHub, is you can download these and play around with them. The whole point of this series is to try and break a concept down into 10 nice small tiny experiments which you can then play around with and then build on. Some of the episodes may have almost like the equivalent of a capstone type project, or a very tiny capstone project, where I sort of bring together elements of what I've been talking about in each experiment, but not in this episode. This is just really bringing together and revisiting in very nice bite-sized pieces some of the things that would have come up in my AI experiments series. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm leaning heavily into Ollama so that I don't have to write any functions to do API requests, to do RESTful API requests. I'm letting Ollama handle all of that. And in previous episodes I've spoken quite a bit how to install Ollama, stuff like that. So I would look at a previous episode on the channel connected with installing Ollama to learn about that, to set the system up. As you can see, I'm using Jupyter Notebooks, so again you'll need to have Jupyter Notebooks installed with Python. I'm using Llama 2 for this all the way through. You could use another model. The only requirement is that it's one that's been downloaded, it's been pulled down into Ollama. And you'll notice I'm not doing any sort of model checking to make sure it's there. There's no pull commands. I'm just diving straight in. So if Llama 2 wasn't in Ollama, I would get error messages. And so to some degree with these tiny experiments, the guardrails are off. There's not going to be a ton of defensive programming going on. That's not the point. All of these will run fine, but there's very little error checking because we're just looking at concepts at their real fundamental level. You'll notice, there's no particular attempt here to create a function and then run it. It is all just raw code. A lot of it's hard coded because we're just trying to grasp concepts. So let's just run this, do that. So yeah, prompt engineering and optimization I've called it, but really it's just about thinking about how to augment prompts in different ways in order to slightly change the way a prompt might behave, and so you can play around with it. But it's always good to start off with just basic prompting, something like this. So all we're doing here is sending a request to the chat API, and again that's all nicely wrapped up, abstracted away inside of the Ollama library, so we don't have to worry too much. And all we have to do is feed it with a model name and a message which contains our role and our content, and it's this: what is the capital of France? And then we get a response back. So we'll just run that in there. What I'll probably do going forward with these actually is probably run them and then while they're running talking about it, because this sometimes will take a little bit of time to sort of spin up. The capital of France is Paris. So very basic question answer type prompt. Then we have this zero shot summarization. We're not really giving it any other information beyond, again, the role and the content. We're asking it to summarize some text, which is this here. So very similar to the previous one. It's just the wording slightly different. So zero shot summarization. We're not doing multiple shots, which we'll look at in a moment, how that might be done. So I will run that. And while we're waiting, I will also run that one. So it's going to feed it in, we'll get something back, and we should see a summary of this. Now, the original text is fairly short, so bizarrely you might find out the summary is actually longer than the original text. But that's the whole point of experiments, is it's fun with this then to replace this with your own text that's a lot longer and see how that summarizes. But it is a question of just saying, okay, summarize the following it. We're not doing anything more than that. Now here we've got a few shot summarization. So in this one, what we're doing is we're giving it some content. So we're saying, okay, we've got a role here of user. Here's our content. The sun is bright today. Summary, bright sun. Another role here, it's a role of an assistant with content. Text is the dog barked loudly at the mailman. Summary, loud dog bark. And then we've got user, content, this time the text, and the text to summarize, and then summary, and it's not finished. So it's going to pull back in the text to summarize from the previous example. And you can see that's exactly what it's done. So what we're trying to do with this one is we're giving it some examples of the sort of, some text followed by the sort of way we want to summarize it. So we're able to reduce the size of the summary by giving it a few examples. We're basically saying, okay, we want the summary to be very succinct. Now we're going to try a chain of thought experiment. So just to go back to the previous one actually. So what you could do here is start playing around with the sort of summary examples as well. And try and see what happens if you mess around with the roles a bit. What if you make it all the assistant or have more user assistant interaction? Just again, it's just trying this out, seeing what happens when you try various things. So with the chain of thought experiment, all it's a question of really doing here, how you augment it, is you add something at the end, like say, let's think step by step. So really what you're doing is you're not adding it in as like a separate request or role. You are simply just adding on the end of the prompt something that's going to indicate that you would like it to, sort of explain its rationale. So for this one, we're doing one of these, a bus leaves somewhere at this time, travels this speed, another bus leaves at this time, travels this speed, and when do they meet? Based on other criteria. And again, feeding it in, you'll notice the structure here is very similar. We've got a role, a user, content, and our COT question. And there's our response. So you can see we get sort of a broken down here. So an interesting experiment to do here is to take off let's think step by step, or to word this slightly differently. Another way of saying, show the chain of thought and experiment with those. Another way you can augment prompts is to get involved in role playing, or set up sometimes you might hear it referred to as a persona. And the way to do that is to use the role of system to feed it a persona. So here what we're saying is, you're a helpful Python programmer, provide only code, examples and explanations. And then you follow that up with the usual role and the content. How do I read a file line by line in Python? So you can create it to adopt various personas, and you can experiment with having no persona, so not having this in here, versus having something and then changing around the persona, and comparing and contrast with having a system request versus not having one. So that's another interesting experiment to provide. And also you can just play around with, the question you're answering. So it doesn't have to be a coding question. You could come up with, another thing where you could say, oh, you're an expert in music genres. Provide me with some examples of albums and artists in the answers. And then you could ask a question about a particular style of music, maybe. That sort of thing. So again, experimenting with different system roles, different personas and different content types. And maybe try combinations that are anathemas to one another, that don't actually quite work right. The classic one is doing something like, you are a pirate, and then ask it a question about coding and then see how that pans out, or not, as the case may be. So next experiment 6, constraint-based programming. So this is where you tag on the end, you augment your prompt in some way by tagging at the end something like this, or there's a constraint in here where it says, in this case, generate a 50-word poem about nature. Now what's interesting is some large language models are better at constraining than others. And the other important point here, of course, when you're doing these experiments, another thing you can try is swapping out the model here. As long as you've downloaded the model in Ollama, you could try something else like Llama 3, you could try Gemma 3, you could try Quen, Mistral. There's loads of different models you can download from the or through the Ollama interface, through the CLI. So here we have a 50-word poem about nature. So what you could do is you could add to this a bit of quality control, and you could actually check to see, actually how many words are there in the poem, and see if it keeps it below 50. Or you could count it manually. You could copy and paste this into Word and get it to do a word count as well, if you wanted to do that. But yeah, you can do things in experiments like, add additional proofreading, quality control, those sort of things. And in later episodes, and also episodes in AI experiments, I am going to look a little bit about are there ways you can corral the answers to prompts. So, do some post response curation, but not necessarily in this particular episode. But that doesn't stop you from experimenting with those things. So then we got experiment 7, which is negative prompting. So we're going to simulate this via an instruction. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask it to do something, but we're going to say, oh, don't do this thing. So here, again, very, very similar to what we've seen previously. We've got a role of a user. We're not doing multi-shots here. So role user, content, describe a cat, but do not mention its fur colour. So you'll be able to go through now and just check that it hasn't mentioned fur colour. And you can do some pretty crazy things and see whether it will deal with it. Is, describe a cat, but don't mention it's a cat. That sort of stuff. And then just see how effective you are in putting your own guardrails on. Now, of course, another thing you can do, and it's worth experimenting with, is using a system prompt to maybe restrict the answer. That's another possibility and something you might want to play around with in these examples. Now, this is really interesting, playing around with the temperature. So there is a set of options that you can issue through RESTful API requests for LLMs in Ollama, and there's quite a number of them, and there's some newer ones as well. I think there's a thinking, although I don't think it's an option. I think it's actually a sort of full-blown attribute rather than a set of them in the options section, but I haven't tried it yet, so don't take my word for it. But yeah, that's definitely appeared very recently. One that's been in there for a long time is temperature. So I think I've mentioned this before. The lower the temperature, the less chaotic the response. The higher the temperature, the more chaotic or more creative. So what you tend to find is if you're asking it something factual, you want a lower temperature. If you're asking it to write a story, you want a higher temperature. Now, a lot of models, their default is around 0.7, somewhere around there. Some models have a range from 0 to 1, some from 0 to 2. But you'll realise once you start playing with models, where the lines are drawn. And if you set it to something stupid like say I was to set this to temperature 200, I think I've done that in the past where I've set it really high. It just basically sets to whatever it's capped off at. So if it never goes above 2 and you put 100 in, it's just going to set it to 2. And vice versa, it will never go lower than 0, I don't think. I don't think you can put negative temperatures in there. Ice cold response. So again, we've got a lower temperature, more deterministic, factual, higher temperature, more creative. And again, you can experiment with, trying a higher one for a more an answer that would normally be deterministic, and then seeing how it gets on. Yeah, so it came back with usually when you ask it simple factual questions, like what is the capital of France, tell me a simple fact, it's going to be pretty quick. Again, remember, I am running this on local hardware with no GPU. This is just on a, 16 gig of RAM. What is this? An i7, basically. That's a good few years old now, but good enough for doing experiments. And there's a high temperature one. And again, you can play around with these, try swapping them around, doing the factual question at a higher temperature and the creative story at a lower temperature. And try other things as well that you think might be suited or not suited to the different temperature combinations. Now, something that's interesting to play around with, and I haven't had a real chance to do this, so at some point I'm going to play around a lot, I think, with experiment 9, is this top K, top P sampling. So with top K, it limits the vocabulary to the K most likely next tokens. Okay, and the top P limits is a cumulative probability limit. Now, I'm not going to try and explain in technical terms exactly what these are. That's part of the fun of experimenting, is to actually see what that represents in when you actually try and do it, and then based on that, try and then go and understand. Okay, I can see why it's doing that, and what the implication is in terms of the technical reason why it's doing it, but then actually how that looks when you try it in real life. So we're going to do one where we're just completing the sentence. Again, you can see pretty straightforward here, but we're playing around in our request with this top K value. And again, depending on the model, you'll find if you read up about it, there's a limit on what values you can put in these. And then with the top P, we've got considering tokens that's some to 50% probability. Now, at the moment, the way these are set up is, and the questions it's answering, you're not going to get massive differences in the answer. I've left this experiment in a fairly, non-experimental state. It's not doing anything particularly weird at the moment. That's because I want people to try out different values here, and also obviously different prompts, just to see what happens when maybe you set slightly unusual values and you really start to push these values when you set them to different things, and whether and how big a difference it makes. And then at some point you can try combining these with the temperature. Once you sort of can see here, well, interestingly enough, options top K and top P are also options. So what you can do is modify some of these so that it's like a series of key value pairs that you're feeding in. Play around with that. And then finally, we have this system prompt. So we're going to see it with and without. We saw the system prompt earlier where we were sort of asking it about producing. So we're using the system prompt here to role play a persona. We're you doing a similar thing here, but we're sort of showing you, I'm showing you with and without. So what are your capabilities without a specific system prompt? Now, one thing to remember is some of the models already have a system prompt that's shrink wrapped into the model anyway. So just bear that in mind. But here what we're doing is we're asking our current model, what are your capabilities? And then the second time we ask it, we're setting the system role to a highly specialized AI assistant focused only on generating rhyming poetry. Same question, but we've actually set the system prompt. So let's have a look. See what happens there in experiment 10. And again, interesting thing to do here, play around with different system prompts. How far can you push it? What personas can you get it to assume? How much does the persona interfere with the actual question you're asking it? What things do you maybe can do to get it to come up with interesting and constructive hallucinations that might be creatively useful? Because it's really interesting when you start to push models right to the limit of their capacity. And I'm not talking about doing that in a malicious way. I'm talking about doing that for creative reasons. So that's pretty interesting experiment. And of course, with a lot of this stuff you've seen so far, you can modify, stack all this. So, for the next cell, one experiment you could try is like stacking some of these. So trying, system prompts with the different sampling stuff, also with the temperature tunings, maybe mix in a bit of few shot stuff as well, chain of thought. So you can all sort of stack this up. You can even get into interesting things to do with templating, where you actually suggest to it as part of the request how you want the results to be shown. And some models I've noticed are better at handling that than others. And the reason for doing that is that then it allows you to do post-processing, where you can take the response and actually start to do manipulation on the text and start to pull sections out to then push into certain tables and data structures and stuff like that. So it is still answering here, if you wonder what it's doing. So this is the first bit with no system prompt. As an AI language model, I am capable of, and it gives a list of things there. And all we did was ask it, what are your capabilities? And that's quite an interesting question in itself, just to ask any model. What are your capabilities? A lot of people don't even think to answer that. And then you can go down some interesting rabbit holes, because you can see what its specializations might be in there and how you might structure that. So doing this last one, hopefully will open up a whole load of other experiments that you can now do by substituting the different prompts that we've covered so far by maybe stuff we haven't covered. Of course, here, the reason why it's taking a bit longer is it's trying to be creative now, because it's got to do take a look at it through a rhyming poetry lens. So we'll see where that ends up. Just trying to think if there's anything else I want to add here. And again, this is pretty straightforward. I've tried to, here you notice a lot of the responses have different names. I mean, we could have probably kept them all as a response and just overwritten them, but I thought that would be quite useful if later on you wanted to take some of the answers and fiddle around with them. Okay. So with a system prompt, a most excellent query, my dear. Adjust monocle. As a highly specialised AI assistant focused solely on generating rhyming poetry, I must say I am quite the virtuoso when it comes to crafting sonnets, odes and other verse forms that are simply sublime. And so we've got rhyme schemes, poetic forms, theme generation, length adjustment, language flexibility, personalised poetry, creative freedom, efficient output, collaboration, unlimited imagination. So then this opens up a whole load of experiments that you could potentially do, where you start giving it a system role, okay, asking this question, what are your capabilities, and then with remembering to have that system role in place, then start asking it for particular tasks based around these, the sort of responses it can deal with. And so we could do something in here like, you are highly specialized AI assistant focusing on generating coding solutions, something like that, something similar to that, and then ask it what are your capabilities and just see how it responds. So there we have it. So I'll upload this sheet to my GitHub. I'll include a link in the description of the video. Thanks once again for watching and enduring my pre-episode ramble, but I thought it'd be just interesting to discuss my thought process for how I often end up with these series, and this was a good case in point. So this was the starting point, but it all occurred on a recent trip to the UK. Thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in a future episode.